Hello and welcome back to this Downfoot Idealistic Crusade. This is a review of the Criterion Collection Blu-ray release of the 1936 science fiction landmark classic, produced by Alexander Korda in the UK, which is revelatory for being a feature production swinging for the fences, essentially, as a science fiction epic in the British film industry at that time, which did not have the same technical abilities that Hollywood did in the golden era of the studio system, which makes this film even more impressive. But this is H.G. Wells' Things to Come. And of course, putting Wells' name in the title is a sign of just how much control he exerted over this film, which was ostensibly based on his pre-existing book, The Shape of Things to Come. But as most people who have read Wells or know his biography and what the extras go into as well, is by at this point, H.G. Wells, while he was probably the most famous name in science fiction and is really the father of modern science fiction, we think of him for The Time Machine and Island of Dr. Moreau and The War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man and his incredible masterworks, but he switched over into, he did some historical works, but he was mainly doing philosophy works and had a very cynical view of how humanity was going. So his whole idea of writing Shape of Things to Come and then getting to make this film and having full creative control was to make a philosophical statement, trying to warn mankind against impending dangers. And in some ways, he did, predict things that would happen in terms of specifically the oncoming of the Second World War, that there would be some cataclysmic conflict between nations that would be coming very soon. So when you see this film, there's a lot of feeling of, even though it's 1936, it does sort of hearken to what must have been the feelings of the tensions that were already brewing in Europe at the time, predating the start of World War II just a few years later. And of course, other things were quickly proven not at all feasible or what was going to happen. So this is it's a very tough film to sell to an audience. It was a tough film to sell to an audience then. It's sure as heck a tough film to sell to an audience now, because I think the best description of how this film feels overall is that it's very preachy. And if that's not your kind of film, and it's not really the label you want to apply to any film that's supposed to be an entertaining narrative, it's kind of a hard watch. So I'd like to preface that at the beginning first for those who haven't seen it. But it's one of those films I think everybody should see at least once in their lives, because after Metropolis in 1927, this was really the first time anybody tried to do a big A-feature full production of a science fiction story. It just so happened that they gave Wells creative control and he was in his philosophy stage, so they were kind of stuck with that. But they were also able to use Wells's name and standing with the public and to also help sell the film. So it was a bit of a back and forth. But it's a film that's always kind of fighting itself, because for all of Wells's good ideas and the parts of his philosophy that did come true and very much feel like they're predicting what would come soon in World War II, it's stumbling over just inherent long monologues of philosophy, and it's not always the most visual of films, which is why the design of Vincent Korda, who was the brother of Alexander Korda, and the direction of William Cameron Menzies is what has to overcome the preachiness of Wells's script that they couldn't mess with and they couldn't touch. And so it's a film that's always, sort of battling itself in that way. And it's why what people remember are the visuals and the design and the costumes and the visions of the futures. Because I say futures plural because this is a film that takes place over many years and many different generations. It's divided almost into sections. We have the opening, which seems very much like present-day England at the time, and then really prefacing what would come just a few years later with the Blitz of London and the bombings overhead by German planes. We see the city of Everytown destroyed, and that is what leads into the sort of cataclysmic war between factions that essentially wipes the slate clean, and the surviving aspects of mankind start to form their own new societies. And that becomes sort of section 2. And from a dramatic perspective, It's the first two sections that have something more for audiences to sort of get on board with and cling on to, because as the film progresses, unfortunately, the narrative has to sort of take a back seat to the philosophy of Wells. And again, this is why I think the best way to describe the film is it is incredibly preachy. So it's definitely a film that most people are probably going to struggle through, but you can't deny the incredible visual style of the film, its design, its direction by Menzies, who was, the great, really the man who defined the term production designer and even came up with the term, and was so far ahead of his time that he never really got recognized or respected for being, decades ahead of everyone else, and designed many of the greatest classics in the Hollywood studio canon, including, of course, Gone with the Wind, and even invented basically even little seemingly mundane concepts like the storyboard. That was Menzies. So it's really Menzies, along with Vincent Corda as designer, who are the ones most responsible for the film's staying power. That's not to say anything against Wells's philosophies, because he means well, but it just doesn't really translate into a film narrative. So it's a film that, feels kind of stodgy, and it is incredibly preachy in areas. That's why the opening section with the destruction of every town, which is incredibly well done by Menzies and Corda. It is extremely effective with an incredible editing job that mixes together the set of every town they constructed, which seems very modern and is filled with extras and cars and trucks and spotlights and flashing signs like you would get in any Metropolis. And then it all goes to hell when the bombing starts, and you have just an incredible mixture of extras running around, explosions, miniatures. It is incredibly effective and very striking and extraordinarily dark as a way to open the film. So that's really your opening section, as sort of seeing where humanity was at this time in the mid to late 30s, and then all that suddenly stops. And it's a fascinating and terrifying concept. So again, the core idea of what Wells is doing and what the film is trying to do is striking and fascinating. It's just, unfortunately, keeps going into, I'm going to preach my philosophy for the next 15 minutes, and it's just going to stop the narrative cold. But then we go into the next section, which is probably the most dramatically effective, where we have basically the new version of Everytown, which has sort of been built up over years and years and years as a bunch of survivors have come together, and eventually one faction claws its way to the top, and a new leader is elected. And basically you see this section where Ralph Richardson is the new leader of things, and it's basically 1936 Mad Max. I mean, it is beautifully done. And if you remember back to Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome with Bartertown and Ani Ennedy played by Tina Turner, that's basically, imagine that sort of scenario of a city built up from nothing after the death of Earth as we know it, and built up by survivors after generations, and how humanity has devolved to a certain point and rebuilt itself in a sort of gross misappropriation of certain aspects of mankind in a new sort of city. You're getting that here in 1936 and the sort of second section of things to come. So I think this is the most fascinating part, because you get something dramatically to latch onto, and this is disrupted by a character coming in from another area who seemingly has technology. This is the second appearance of the lead sort of character that echoes throughout the film, who's played by Raymond Massey. He is a sort of he's a scientist in the opening who witnesses the destruction of Everytown and then gets sucked up into the war effort, and now is much more aged, but comes into this environment of the new Everytown with the sort of no man's land, rough sort of monarchy dictatorship that's been established. And he obviously comes from somewhere else unknown and has technology he has with him that they, of course, want to appropriate for purposes of, obviously warlike tendencies. So it starts this interesting dynamic where the characters played by Raymond Massey and Ralph Richardson represent these two warring factions, and so you get to see the philosophy of Wells actually be debated in narrative form, represented by having the two sides represented by two different characters and how they butt heads, and what does Richardson's king dictator immediately do but have Massey's character thrown in prison because he won't just hand over his supreme technology for Richardson's dictator to then try and take over the world, because what else are you going to do? So it becomes a battle of wills for a little bit. And again, this is the most dramatically fascinating and section of the film for people to get invested in. But then we rather quickly transition out of that into the sort of next generation area, where we get into the sort of next evolution of Everytown and the final sort of vision of the future, which is the most famous imagery of the film, the beautiful design of the very, very striking Everytown reimagined as a sort of underground metropolis, and all of their technologies and their costumes and the vast city that exists as a sort of new utopia where mankind is able to live at its greatest extent, both spiritually and mentally. But of course, seeing all of this, the inherent criticism is, it's really too perfect, and it's unknown exactly how much, if any, Wells wanted to acknowledge this, but it very much has a sort of dystopian flavor to it, and that's also something I think a more modern viewpoint will immediately pick up on, as opposed to seeing this in 1936 on the original release. But there are factions that develop that don't necessarily agree with the leadership of the new Everytown, and rather interestingly, the leader is once again played by Raymond Massey as the descendant of his original character. So we have that idea carried through of the sort of passage of time as represented by a particular single human line. And of course, it allows you to have the same actor play the lead role in each section. So it's a film full of fascinating ideas. And it's a film that is constantly fighting itself because it is beautiful to look at. It is beautifully directed by William Cameron Menzies and designed by Vincent Corda. But it's having to fight the script that it's stuck with. And everybody wanted to change it and do things, but they had to go up against H.G. Wells, who was there on set every day and insisted it had to be his way, and it was in his contract. And that was also because he was not a fan at all of how the previous film adaptations of his works had been done. He was especially displeased with Paramount's Island of Lost Souls in 1932, taking his extremely philosophical novel Island of Dr. Moreau and turning it into one of the most grisly, gloriously gleeful pre-code horror films ever made. Although, ironically, it actually does do the best job of adapting his novel. It is still the best film version of Island of Dr. Moreau. There's a lot of it in there, but it's also sadistic in a lot of ways, where his book was more philosophical. So it's understandable why he was miffed about that, but that's why he insisted on he wanted to have control. And this was also very near and dear to his heart because he meant his works of philosophy to be a sort of warning. He wanted to make mankind think about what they were doing. And while not everything that was in his philosophy was something you might agree with or was something that would actually turn out to be true, he did have the best intentions, but it didn't necessarily translate into an effective cinematic narrative, which is the film's problem. So that's why it is easily one of the most preachy films ever made, and that's its big stumbling block. There's very little for an audience to really grasp onto, aside from getting another lecture about philosophical concepts. And it's like, okay, yes, we get this, but where's the story? That's you're left hanging continually. So it's a film that's probably going to be a hard watch for a lot of people. It does feel a bit long in places. And even the actors had problems with this because they didn't. Raymond Massey even complained that a lot of times he felt like he was just giving long monologues, and there was nothing for him to really do other than just recite this dialogue. And Menzies himself admitted, he was not really that good as an actor's director. That wasn't his forte. He was much more invested in the visuals, but he wasn't really handling the design because that was being done by Vincent Corda. So this is a film where you've actually got several different entities. You've got Alexander Korda as producer. You've got Vincent Korda as designer. You've got the brilliant visionary William Cameron Menzies as the director. And then you've got H.G. Wells with the full creative control. So it unfortunately causes the film to kind of collapse on itself a little bit. But again, I think this is a film everyone should see at least once in their lives, because for science fiction in films, there is really nothing between Metropolis in 1927 and Things to Come in 1936 to be this audacious and bold and gigantic in scale. I mean, this is an absolute marvel that this film was made at this time in the British film industry, and it's really only due to Alexander Korda, putting it all on the line and saying, we're going to do this and we're going to go all out and get every single facet of the British film industry to be at its absolute highest in quality and standards, and put 110% effort in across the board. So even if the story doesn't really work because it's really more just disguising a work of philosophy in film form, it is an absolute marvel. And especially for the fact it was made at this time in 1936 in Great Britain, which had, a really fantastic film industry, but one that was never going to be on the same technical level as what you would get in Hollywood. And the design, the effects work, the model work, everything across the board is really phenomenal. And that all goes to the talents, I think, of Vincent Korda and William Cameron Menzies in the director's chair. So Things to Come is really one of the important, groundbreaking, landmark science fiction films, but it is definitely a hard sell, and it's going to be very perplexing if you don't have a knowledge of H.G. Wells and you just go in cold. Rather famously, this was the film that Arthur C. Clarke showed Stanley Kubrick when they were starting to work on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And Kubrick famously asked Clarke, "What are you doing to me? This is terrible. I can't." But ironically, if you're a giant fan of 2001 and you're a Kubrick fan, you will recognize there is some sort of shared DNA, and the way that Things to Come as a film is a bit distant from its human characters and has loads of philosophy. So even though Kubrick apparently hated how talky and preachy this film was, I think some of what Wells was after may have rubbed off on Clarke and Kubrick a little bit, because I think you can recognize just a little tiny bit of shared sort of distance philosophical science fiction inherent in 2001 that is in Things to Come. So I think it's really fascinating to look at that. So I think anyone who's ever seen 2001 and loves 2001 and comes to Things to Come is going to at least feel some of that, even if you can't put your finger on it. It's a fascinating idea. And of course, again, you can read Clarke's recollection about that. It's published in most editions of the 2001 novel, which of course differs significantly from the film in a number of ways. But I just find it fascinating that even Stanley Kubrick had to sit through this film and was even sort of squirming in his seat and going, "What am I watching?" But you can't help but marvel at the visuals of this film. So that's why I say it's a film that should be seen by everyone at least once in their lives. And it's also been a difficult film to see because the film was subjected to a significant number of edits and has had many different releases at different run times over the years. So getting to see a more complete version has been a real challenge. So that is why the most recent and longest running preservation master, which is now on Blu-ray from Criterion here in the US. And I think Network put it out in the UK on DVD and Blu-ray as well. That's why seeing it now is a lot better because now you can get a greater idea of what the film is going for. Because before, it had been chopped down to various runtimes, below 90 minutes even, and it was at times made a bit incomprehensible for sure. So this is a film where you do really want to see the new or newest restoration that was completed a number of years ago, but also go in knowing that it's not pristine. They are limited by the sources they were working with, so it is going to have some baked-in issues, but this is now finally the longest and most complete version we've ever had of the film that at least approaches what it looked like on the original release, which ironically is another connection to Lang's Metropolis, which was famously cut down and butchered and shown in a variety of different terrible versions for decades and had to be rediscovered and put back together, and then took years and years and years for that miraculous 16 millimeter footage to turn up a handful of years ago and be reinstated for a more complete version. So ironically, both Metropolis and Things to Come sort of suffered that long fate, and there were, rights issues. So there are many terrible public domain prints and terrible versions of Things to Come floating around, just like there are of Metropolis. So it had that same sort of storied, long, varied history of terrible versions and edited versions out there. So to talk about the picture quality of the Criterion release, this is licensed from ITV. It is the same restoration that was released on DVD and Blu-ray in the UK. So it is the same, as good as we can get, extended, again, I should say, as close to the original release premiere version as we can get. So it is the most complete version of the film to date. This is the version you should see. Don't really bother with any of the shorter versions. However, it does not have a version that tries to incorporate deleted or missing scenes as the British disc does. They use a number of stills and script excerpts to try and recreate a number of extra minutes that are not in the actual restoration because the footage no longer survives. Some of these deleted scenes and materials are discussed slightly in some of the extras, but I do wish there had been a special supplement just about the missing or deleted materials, or a copy of the sort of reconstruction version that is on the British release. So that is one sort of benefit of having the British release, which is otherwise the same restoration master for the feature. So the master itself is the same. Now, to talk about what you're going to see in the picture quality, again, they are very limited to the sources they have, so this is never going to be a pristine presentation, but it is by far the most amazing quality this film has ever had, because it has been in really dire shape and in all kinds of terrible versions. And the first time I saw this, it looked ungodly. So this is already a revelation compared to how it's been before. So you are going to notice that there is inherent damage throughout the feature, on and off. It is, unfortunately just kind of baked in there, but unless a miraculous better source turns up, this is just kind of how it is. There is also some occasional little bits of frame wobble, but that is, understandable because it is pretty much baked into the source they're working with. You are going to see some definite occasional lines. You're going to see some occasional scratches. Some actual damage is going to pop up. It's never major, it's never overwhelming, but it is, again, a sign of just how much this film has been kicked around over the years. So it's really amazing we even have something at this level of quality they were able to get to. And all you have to do is look at any of the crappy public domain versions or uploads anywhere. Just 2 seconds of one of those will make you marvel at how much they were able to pull out of what has survived in this master. You're also going to see some hairs poke in every once in a while. Nothing major, but if you're going to have lines and scratches, you're almost always going to have hairs and bits of dirt pop in as well. So it's all the sort of typical damage and wear that you expect in any source that has been this compromised. There's also a little bit of occasional sections where the damage gets heavier, or they seemed to have had to have mixed in an alternate source or a lesser quality source like a dupe section or another print source. So you are going to get a couple little bits of that, but it is mainly of the same higher quality source for most of the feature. There are unfortunately a couple missing frames as well, but that is to be expected with a film that has been this compromised in its preservation status all these years, and for trying to reconstruct the as close as we can get to the original premiere edit. Then there are also some transitions that are a little ragged, like it's missing some frames, or the optical transitions are damaged, or aren't all fully there. So again, this is a preservation. This is not necessarily a, yes, there was restoration work, but it is not pristine. It is trying to save and resurrect this film and get it back to as close to the original release edit as we can get. There are many examples of films that are unfortunately stuck in this sort of status, but this film, you're not going to be able to escape that. And it is, it is what it is, essentially. And this is the best that could be done at the time in the early sort of 2010s. So I guess if they decided to revisit this in 4K and redo work with modern digital tools, they could probably get it a little bit better. But I don't know if the source is going to warrant that, because the source is already so compromised. So again, this is the best the film has ever looked on home video, and it's at its most complete form on home video. So this is the version you want to see, whether it is the Criterion Blu-ray here in the US or the British Blu-ray release of the same master. My only real complaint, this is admittedly minor, but it really did bug me. This is one of those where they do these masters where they have the new copyright information to copyright the new work, which is fine. But they do the thing where they actually have it at the very end of the feature. So as we have the end and the final fade out to black, it actually comes up in picture, and it's, copyright ITV, 2010 or 2013 or whatever it was. And I'm like, no, I hate it when they do that. That should be, as after the feature ends, you have an additional title card at the very end. That's a new simple title card outside of the feature. I hate it when they superimpose text or something over any part of a feature. So it's admittedly minor. It's only at the very, 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 very end. But, if you're going to watch things to come and you get to the very end, it does take you out of it just a little tiny bit. So that's a more personal quirk, I admit. It's a very minor thing, but it really did bug me. So I do wish they had actually placed it outside of the feature end credits. So that's my only real qualm with the picture quality. Now, the audio is the original mono mix. It has also been restored. It is here on the Blu-ray in lossless quality. And like the picture, it is full of age-related problems and source-related problems. So you're going to hear hiss, you're going to hear hum, you're going to hear pops, ticks, scratches, jumps in the audio where there are missing frames. That is all to be expected. And, it's really miraculous we were able to actually have the film reconstructed to this point in this level of quality. So again, the audio is like the picture. It is as good as it could be at the time this restoration master was done. But again, keep in mind, this is all a preservation of extremely limited and damaged elements. So it's going to have all of these age-related problems. And if you were to try and go overzealous with your noise reduction application and try to use digital tools to cover up this stuff, you're just going to make it worse by making the soundtrack lifeless. So you really just have to have it as is. And this is still the best experience I've had with this film, because again, before this, we've had nothing but terrible public domain releases and cheap releases from various terrible prints that have different edits and different runtimes. So the audio is like the picture. It is compromised due to the surviving sources, but this is the best we've yet had for this film, and probably the best it's going to be unless there's some miraculous source that's discovered. Now we come to Criterion's Blu-ray, which is Spine 660, which was released in 2013. To talk about the packaging and artwork design, I think this is one of Criterion's best Blu-ray designs. I really love it when they have one of these bold colored covers and they mix it with black and white imagery. I love the bold orange color on this, and the fact that they have recreated the original title and show you enough of the amazing visual style of this film to really entice somebody to this release who has never heard of it before. So the artwork is absolutely fantastic. Carries over onto the spine and the rear, so everything is beautifully uniform. And then that carries over to the interior, because they have given you the breathtaking visuals of the final act of the film with the fully modernized futuristic Everytown. across the booklet and the disc with Raymond Massey there and the interior artwork. So it all feels uniform and gives you that amazing sort of visual reveal that you get in the film. So the first time you open this, you sort of are like, wow, that's fantastic if you've never seen the film before. So I really have to commend them for getting that across in the actual artwork and packaging. And then with everything removed, we also have the chapter listing. Now to turn to the booklet, this is a beautiful booklet, and surprisingly for a Criterion release, it is actually stapled. So this is not one of their big fold-outs we kind of get annoyed with, but that's also because this has a quite extensive essay along with beautiful imagery. But Jeffrey O'Brien does the essay, which is quite lengthy, so I think that's why this is a bound or stapled book instead of the usual fold-out. But the essay is quite lengthy, and then we get the technical credits as well. So this does run, a good number of pages, so it's a bit thicker. So it's a much more substantial booklet than what you get in a typical standard Criterion Blu-ray release. And then we turn to the other supplements, and this is where, again, this release really stands out, because this is absolutely loaded in terms of the extras. Chief among them, and the best extra, is the audio commentary by the incredible David Callett, who, for this, as with all his other commentaries I've heard, gives a fascinating, jam-packed commentary filled with information and all kinds of facets about the film you may have not even considered. Listening to this, I already have it in my list of the greatest commentaries I've ever heard, along with his other commentaries I've heard him do, like his incredible, also must-listen, one of the best commentaries ever for Nosferatu. So this is a disc you should purchase just for the commentary and the other extras, but the commentary is outstanding. Again, one of the best commentaries I've ever heard. Not surprising coming from David Callett, who has done a number of the best commentaries I've ever heard. So that in and of itself would constitute a whole extras package worth of material, because it's that informative and well done. But we also have a lengthy interview with Sir Christopher Frayling, who talks about the film and specifically about its design and the principal characters involved, H.G. Wells, Vincent Corda, and William Cameron Menzies, along with Alexander Corda as well. So anytime you can get Sir Christopher Frayling talking about films and you get him going at length, it is just a master class. So that is a totally beyond worthwhile inclusion, and so wonderful that that's here. So we already have two, as far as I'm concerned, two of the big names of film scholarship included here. But no, we have a third, because Bruce Eder returns to a Criterion release from the Laserdisc days, and he does a very lengthy video essay about the score of the film, which was done by Arthur Bliss, which is also incredibly historically important and became very successful on its own outside of the film. And the film was really designed to work with the score. The score was sort of written in tandem with Wells, and so this is really an example of a musical score for a film written before the film was actually fully shot, and so the film was designed to run in tandem with the music, and everything was specifically created to go with each other. So it's again an example of a score being written and conceived this way instead of being done after the fact and spotting and timing to the rough edit of the film, as the vast majority of film scores are done. So getting Bruce Eder to do a whole video essay about the score, which is to his usual extremely high standards, is extraordinarily worthwhile and revealing of the score's complexities and its a long history, again, outside of the film. In fact, the score is the most successful thing about the film and the element with the longest lasting legacy. So it's great we have that gone into further detail by the great Bruce Eder. So I think you have three of the great film scholar names on this release in the supplemental features. But then we also have a really fascinating piece, which is the unused effects footage that was designed and shot for the film by the famous artist, and I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, so I do apologize, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. I probably butchered that. Terribly sorry. But he was commissioned to do some of his particular style of artwork for this film to be a potential future shown, but it was really deemed not what they were looking for. But he went ahead and shot all this footage of all of these pieces he had designed, and so they have included it here on the release so you can actually look at it, and it's fascinating. Even if you're not really an art person, it's fascinating to see somebody go to this level of design and this level of quality craftsmanship and then actually film it in the 1930s and then just send them this film. And then they were just kind of like, we don't know what to do with this. It's great, but and so I guess they just put it on a shelf somewhere. And now that has finally turned up and been scanned and put on the supplements section. And then also we have a really fascinating time capsule piece because there's an audio recording from 1936 from a reading of H.G. Wells's actual writing about the wandering sickness that takes place in the film and sets up the world of the sort of second section of mankind rebuilding itself in some shape or form in the individual sort of towns, city-states that emerge. So that's fascinating, hearing a vintage recorded piece from the time the film was made and released of actual Wells material. It's very much a time capsule experience. And again, then it mentions the booklet. So that closes out the supplements, which really are essential. They enhance your viewing of the film. Even if you hated the film because it was so preachy and weird and felt long and stuff, you really do need to check out the supplements on the Criterion release because they will enhance your appreciation of the film's highlights and your appreciation of the film's production, and just giving you an incredible dose of historical context, which is really essential to go along with viewing this film because you really can't see this without some knowledge of its production and its importance in spite of the inherent issues. Again, my only real complaint is I do wish there was some material outside of a brief mention about the specific deleted materials. Some of the extras do mention it, but again, the UK disc release did include a reconstruction version with some stills and things. You can actually see an attempt at including those and reincorporating them, but only on the British release. But the British Blu-ray release doesn't have all the extras of the Criterion, even though they share the same master. So you will have to choose which release you do prefer, but I do think the Criterion has the more comprehensive supplemental features package, and it is one of their really great supplement packages that is truly essential for understanding the film better. So those are my thoughts on the Criterion Blu-ray release of Things to Come from 1936. This is the other great science fiction landmark film directed by the legendary William Cameron Menzies. He would go on, of course, to direct another of the all-time great science fiction films in 1953's Invaders from Mars. So Menzies is really responsible for two of the great landmark sci-fi films. So he was no stranger to sci-fi, essentially, by the time he got to Invaders from Mars. And it's a fascinating sort of double feature to look at, the two great science fiction works of directed by William Cameron Menzies that are totally opposite from each other in terms of style and certainly in terms of production budget and production faculties behind them, because Invaders from Mars is famously, or rather infamously, extremely low budget. But they remain two of the most important and iconic and landmark science fiction films of their era. And again, Things to Come needs to be examined and looked at and respected for being the first major large-scale production science fiction feature film after Metropolis. And because this film was not successful really at all, it took a long while before any major studio decided to invest a lot of money in science fiction. And by a long while, I mean really into the science fiction craze, because after this point, science fiction was viewed as much more, fodder for a B film subject or a serial or a children's feature. It was not viewed very seriously again until studios decided to invest money in science fiction when the science fiction in printed form explosion happened in the late 40s into the science fiction craze of the 50s, from science fiction magazines and science fiction in terms of actual novels, and especially in paperback form. So there really is a sort of drought for large-scale science fiction A films after this point until you get to the classic 50s era. And I think a lot of people in Hollywood especially, might have thought back to this film, to things to come, as a sort of, well, you can't do science fiction because if you do that, you're going to have another things to come. But it's still a fascinating artifact of its time, and it's a fascinating landmark for being a big, large scale science fiction production with incredible visuals and an extremely far ranging story with multiple different views of different worlds over time. Made in the UK in 1936, which again was much more limited technically than had this been made at a Hollywood studio. You could imagine how much more lavish this would have been had MGM made it, the crown prince of studios in Hollywood in 1936. It would have been an MGM lavish spectacular, obviously, in terms of the production value. Well, they didn't have that luxury, but they again poured in 110% in terms of effort, and that, along with the visuals and the incredible score and other elements of the film, are what make it fascinating and just a fascinating artifact. But it will always be a sort of hard sell for audiences. So that's why, again, the special features and seeing this reconstructed version is the best way to experience this film. So, as always, I hope my babblings on classic films and physical media releases have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I do really encourage people to actually check out H.G. Wells's Things to Come from 1936. It is one of the landmark important science fiction films, even if it will always be preachy as all get out. I do think the Criterion release is obviously the best release to date, and the release that you do want to see the film in the current and most complete to date preservation master, and the supplements are fantastic. So as always, I do encourage people to keep supporting both studio and boutique label releases by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive, and thank you ever so much for watching.